carbon tax. Pretty important in parts of the country like New Brunswick, where I come from. I think he's shown a willingness to evolve policies, but we have to let the government be sworn in, and we have to let the Prime Minister talk to the premiers over the next couple of weeks.
So that was the Minister of International Trade and Intergovernmental Affairs, Dominic LeBlanc, in an interview that's set to air this weekend on CTV's Question Period with Vassy Kapelos. Now, as you heard there, the Cabinet still has to be sworn in, and we now know it'll happen next Tuesday, May 13th. So will Dominic LeBlanc keep his job, or will he be moved into a different portfolio? Now, he was critical enough to be in that meeting inside the Oval Office this week, but is that enough for someone to keep in that job? 1 week ago, Prime Minister Mark Carney committed to a, quote, efficient and focused cabinet, one also with gender parity. So how difficult will that be, and how tricky is the process of making a federal cabinet? Joining me now are two people who have some experience in that. Eddie Goldenberg was Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. He's now Senior Advisor at Global Public Affairs. And David McLaughlin was the Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. Thank you both for being here. I appreciate that.
Glad to be here. Pleasure.
So, Mr. Goldenberg, take us inside the process. How difficult is it to sit down, look at all the names, and place them in the right chairs?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that is a decision made by the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister alone. He may consult a few people, he may not, but it is very much the Prime Minister's decision. I think cabinet for every Prime Minister depends on that Prime Minister's priorities and how that Prime Minister intends to govern. Obviously, there are a couple of things that are useful for everybody. There has to be regional representation, not necessarily from every province, but regional representation. And you want ministers who are going to perform well, you hope, in the House of Commons. But in terms of Mr. Carney, he has said that he is not there for business as usual. He wants to do some big things, and he will form a cabinet in order to do that. His priority, he has two major priorities. One is Canada-US, and you'll see whatever ministers he chooses. I'd say Canada-US and international geopolitics and geoeconomics will focus on that. He also wants to focus on the economy and not in a business-as-usual way. So he'll put together an economic team that allows him to deliver. And I think what Mr. Carney is going to look for is delivery, not talk. And we'll see how, and he will judge his ministers on their ability to deliver on his priorities. Another one, for example, he's talked a lot about housing. So he's going to have a housing minister who will be expected to deliver.
Yeah.
And he's going to choose that. Who he consults is entirely up to him, whether he consults widely or with two people or in front of the shaving mirror in the morning.
Yeah.
It's entirely up to him.
And Mr. McLaughlin, I think it's interesting because to try and convince some candidates to run, sometimes you tell them, hey, look, I believe you're a star candidate. Maybe I'll get you a cabinet position. How key is that in trying to measure who goes in and who doesn't?
Well, most prime ministers are or leaders of parties going in are very careful about, overtly promising a cabinet position because it gets out.
Yeah.
It's hard to keep any secrets in official Ottawa. And so it taints the dynamics a lot. Ultimately, it is the personal, as Eddie said, it's the personal choice and decision of the Prime Minister. And so there is art, but there is some science to it. Regional representation for sure. And he now has some seats, has a seat in Saskatchewan, has a couple of seats in Alberta, has some seats in Vancouver Island, for example. So these things go into the mix. Quebec delivered big time for the Liberal Party, so he has some more choices there. But he clearly did reach out to some people to have them, run. He recruited some candidates. So if he, I'm sure he didn't overtly promise a cabinet position, but he is certainly going to give them some due consideration. And if he wants to make this cabinet and his government different from the government that he, of his predecessor, which I think has to be a political priority, then he is going to have some new faces who have not been in Parliament before, new to the Liberal Party, and will be new around the table.
How important is that, though, Mr. Goldenberg, when you consider you also need experienced people in this moment? This is a moment that is different than any other we've seen in our history when you consider where we are with the United States and globally as well. So he really does have to have a mix, doesn't he?
Yes, I'm sure he does have to have a mix. I think it's really important to have a cabinet with some people who've been ministers before, who know how it works, and it's important to have new people. The thing that I would say is, from what David said, one of the problems he faces, and all prime ministers face, is how big does he want the cabinet to be?
Yeah.
The bigger it is, the easier it is in a sense, because you can put more people in. I think Mr. Carney, from what he has said, would probably prefer to have as small a cabinet as possible, understanding the need for regional representation and all of that. And the smaller the cabinet, the tougher the decisions. But Prime Minister Carney is looking for delivery.
Yeah.
And you don't necessarily get delivery with 40 people or 45 people around a table.
Yeah,
so he understands that. So it's a balance he's going to have to take, and he'll look at it. He'll announce his cabinet on Tuesday, and he won't judge his cabinet by the reaction from people on Tuesday afternoon. He'll judge it over the next course of 6 months or a year. If he finds that people are delivering well, great. If he finds people aren't performing up to his expectations, he'll change them. And we'll see where it goes from there.
Yeah, and Mr. McLaughlin, he had said a focused cabinet, and we saw that in that first cabinet making, and really it seemed, as a lot of people had called it, almost like a wartime cabinet because of the situation. He's also said he wants to make sure that there's gender parity. That was something that was started under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. How important is it for a Prime Minister to make sure that his cabinet not only is effective, as Mr. Goldenberg was saying, but also reflects Canada as a population?
Well, our first cabinet maker, Sir John A. Macdonald, said, give me better wood or better timber, and I'll build you a better cabinet. I mean, you work with what you've got.
Yeah.
That's the reality. But within that, yes, you set some priorities. So competence, as Eddie's talking about, he has to deliver on what he's talked about, and he is a different kind of prime minister from Mr. Trudeau in his, I think, focus on issues and policies and priorities. He's going to come at things a little bit differently. So competence, first of all, but reflective of the country. So that's the regional piece of it. But we have made some strides, if you will, in social terms of having gender equality, gender equity across. And so that is certainly something the Liberal Party cares about. And so I think he will try to make that happen. Within that, if he sacrifices competence so overtly, for example, and puts somebody in a senior position for gender reasons or regional representation reasons who is clearly not up to the job, then he's going to find himself in the position that Eddie's talking about, and in 6 months or a year, he's going to have to change that person. That's never a good look for a prime minister, right? So he's going to put these things into the mix, but it will say something to Canadians. We will not judge, exactly on that first day, but we will get first impressions and very good impressions about what's important to him. Housing. If he puts a strong minister in housing and says that's what we need to do, okay, that's pretty clear. Look at the energy and environment portfolios with what's happening with Western Canada. I mean, job one of any prime minister is always national unity. And so these are symbols, if you will, and cues to the rest of the country as to his priorities and the politics of how he's going to approach for it. So good chance.
I just add to what David said, but competence is not restricted to white males.
No, for sure.
He can have a gender-balanced cabinet with very competent people, male and female.
Absolutely.
So, I don't think that is going to be a problem for him.
But how short of a leash will he have? To the point the two of you were making, and also in terms of what Mr. Carney is like, and I say that very businesslike from what we've seen. Even that first cabinet meeting, cameras were allowed in. It looked very much like a CEO sitting around a table with his board. Not to say how hard will he be, but I'll come back to that question. How much of a leash do these cabinet ministers have to make sure that they're delivering at the pace that he wants them to?
I think he will expect delivery. He will also expect ministers to be ministers. Mm-hmm. Most areas of government, he won't focus on. He'll focus on, laser-like, on a few priorities, on Canada-US, on the international economic situation. He's going to focus on the economy, and he's going to let his ministers be ministers. And he will judge them on their ability to deliver. He's not going to tell them, every day. He's not going to call them in every day and say, this is what I expect from you tomorrow.
Right.
He's going to tell them what he expects from them when he appoints them, and then he's going to let them do their job.
Because they should be competent enough.
And that's what a good CEO does.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, Mike, and I'd be watching for what Eddie is talking about, because that's his style of governing. I mean, the style any prime minister brings is to governing is also the style of the government writ large. Yeah. And so every cabinet for new government, there's also announced cabinet committee compositions. So one of the things I think we should be looking for is, does Mr. Carney resurrect a policy and priorities committee, a smaller inner cabinet, to help direct things and run things, or an operations committee, in order to have that focused, narrow, aligned on the key issues. That he's going to have a smaller cabinet for sure than what Mr. Trudeau had. He's already demonstrated some of that. But these will tell us about how he's going to govern. Bigger cabinets, it makes everybody happy for a while, but it is harder to manage. You need an infrastructure underneath it, right, to do so.
I just add, Prime Minister Chrétien had very few cabinet committees,
right?
Because he believed that he wanted ministers to spend time doing their job as ministers and not sitting around cabinet committees. That his predecessor had too many. Prime Minister Trudeau the first, he felt, had too many. I think Justin Trudeau had a great number of cabinet committees, which meant that ministers were spending most of their time talking around a cabinet table, often on issues that weren't their own departmental business, and didn't have that much time to work on their own departments. I think Mr. Carney, we'll see what Mr. Carney does. I'm sure he's looked at various options, and I suspect that the type of CEO he was is likely to have fewer cabinet committees than more cabinet committees.
Last word to you on that.
I agree with that, and I would think that we will get a very clear sense about what he wants to do first. What are the kinds of things, the priorities that he's setting for the country with this cabinet? It's going to be a different kind of government from before, but this is really his first new cabinet. He set it out a little bit beforehand. This is actually where we'll see what he plans to do as Prime Minister.
That's right.
A bit of a preview about a month ago, but now we get the real show coming up. Okay. Thank you both for being here. David McLaughlin, former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, Eddie Goldenberg, former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. Real pleasure having you here. Appreciate it.
Pleasure for us.
Thank you.